On this edition of Let's Explore This, we are going to be discussing a small but important town that became an intact commercial center typical of development in western North Carolina communities from the mid-19th through the mid-20th centuries. It is a town that holds a period of historical significance of circa 1849 to 1957. Marshall, the town we will be discussing on this episode, was located on the old Drovers Road that connected Greenville, Tennessee, with Greenville, South Carolina. We will delve further into that history a bit later, but here we are at what appears to be the core of Marshall, a town that did not experience extensive growth until after the arrival of the railroad in 1882. Again, back to its history a bit later. Marshall is a town that can be found on the bank north of the French Broad River and paralleling the railroad tracks of the Southern Railroad. The core of the town is bounded roughly by the railroad right-of-way on the south, a rock cliff and rear property line on the north, by Redmond Road on the west, and by Hardwick Branch Drive on the east. Those boundaries are just for the town core. The boundaries of the entire town itself are in fact much larger. The town core, though, it encompasses approximately 13 acres, incorporating within its boundaries a concentration of 1 to 3 story brick buildings that line both sides of Main Street, a road that runs east to west, picking up additional contributing properties on adjacent side streets. The town core does hold an intact grouping of Marshall's core central buildings from the mid-19th century through 1950. In general, the 19th century commercial building appears to be more ornamented than the later buildings. Amongst all of this, there is a mid-19th century house that does remain on Main Street. This house is typical of wood frame residences of that time period and of what was built in Marshall by the end of the 19th century. The early 20th to the mid-20th century buildings appear to be overall less ornamented. We are going to delve deeper into the architecture a bit later. For now, though, let me just finish this brief overall architectural description before moving on to the topography. Generally, the buildings lining Main Street on the north and on the south are contiguous, with uniform setbacks. Architectural styles in the town core include the commercial style, the Romanesque Revival, the Mission Revival, the Gothic Revival, and the Neoclassical Revival styles. Main Street in the mid to late 19th century was comprised mostly of wood frame buildings, many of which were residences, but the primarily brick and stone construction of the 20th century came to change the character of the street to much of what it is today. Despite that, the building uses along Main Street did not change. Still, today, there do exist primarily commercial uses along with a handful of residences and religious institutional buildings. Okay, so you might be wondering as to what happened here. Why does the town look so devastated? Well, we are shortly going to delve into that. The topography of the town center is flat, lying partially above the floodplain of the French Broad River. Buildings on the south side of Main Street are within this floodplain, with the courthouse and the north side of Main Street being slightly higher in elevation. Now, keep in mind, much of Marshall lies within the floodplain, And in late 2024, Hurricane Helene flooded and devastated the region. It is heartbreaking to see the kind of devastation this town had to endure. It may take years, if not even a decade or so, for the town to fully recover from a disaster of this magnitude. Marshall was not the only town to be devastated either, as so many in western North Carolina had to face a similar fate. Sites like this have helped to fund the rebuilding effort, but believe me, this is not enough, not even close. For example, the flood of 2024 completely wiped out the old historic train depot that used to stand here in this location. Reportedly, progress is in the works for the rebuilding of the historic depot that was built in the late 1890s originally. Despite the date, ironically, the National Register document does not even readily discuss the depot. Not sure why that is, but it is difficult not to ignore the fact that Marshall is in a precarious position. Often, proper management of a floodplain can help protect the town, given the town is willing to take part in such an effort. All too often, developers make that difficult. This town, however, is not really like that. It is a bit different. As you can see here, the town of Marshall takes up the floodplain. The river cannot move. It has nowhere to go. So, what can be done? You know, there are no easy answers to that question. There will always be that risk of flooding here. It is part of the town, part of its history, and part of its future. Certainly, floodplain management can help. Notice this area, which lies just above Marshall. A little bit of a floodplain there, all developed. They have taken away just about all areas in this region the river can use to spread out. Can the town and the river find a way to live in harmony? Certainly, but it will never be without its fights. Let's just hope it and the river can learn to respect each other. Hopefully, ways can be found in helping the town better flood-proof their structures. As far as the French Broad River goes, believe it or not, it holds a remarkable success story that deserves to be explored, and we will explore that a bit later. Okay, so outside of the town core, to the north, are residential areas up the hillside. To the east, in that direction, are some additional, more modern commercial properties separated by vacant lots. Then, to the west, in that direction, one will find new residential and commercial development. Oh, wow. So, I thought Christmas was in December. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Okay, so the core of the town was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2007, designated as the Marshall Main Street Historic District. It has retained its historic integrity, despite the loss of a handful of historic buildings currently replaced by modern structures, as well as some minor architectural changes to individual buildings. So, what do you say we delve much deeper into the history of Marshall? As noted in this book, A Guide to the Historic Architecture of Western North Carolina, Madison County has often been known as the Kingdom of Madison for its isolation and the independence of its people, creating a dual heritage that encompasses rural mountain culture and a once great mineral spring at Hot Springs. Bisecting the steep terrain, the French Broad River courses through its narrow gorge from Asheville to Paint Rock at the Tennessee state line. The southeast part of the county, including Marshall, traded with Asheville, while the north and west sections were oriented to Greenville, Tennessee. Along the ledge on the right bank of the river, early road builders hacked the route of the Buncombe Turnpike in the 1820s. Drovers, herding livestock down the turnpike. From Tennessee to the coastal lowlands created a market for local farmers' corn and other food crops. And the low country elite came in their carriages up the turnpike for summer stays at the famous springs. I am taking that to mean the town of Hot Springs. Marshall, the county seat of Madison County, was founded in 1855, and it was named for Chief Justice John Marshall. The commercial center of Marshall has often been referred to as 1 mile long, 1 block wide, and sky high. Main Street is the main route through town, resting on the north side of the French Broad River. Development there was limited to the south, in addition to the river by the railroad, and on the north by steep mountainsides. Main Street was originally the route of the old Drover's Road, connecting Greenville, Tennessee, with Greenville, South Carolina, which would later become the Buncombe Turnpike. The oldest building in the town center, the Colonel Lawrence M. Allen House, serves as a reminder of this time period when mostly houses and drovers' stands lined the north and south sides of Main Street. It was not until the coming of the railroad and the beginnings of the tourism industry that the town of Marshall would begin to flourish. In 1882, the Western North Carolina Railroad was completed from Asheville through Marshall to Paint Rock at the Tennessee state line. This began the boom time in building construction. By the end of the 19th century, there were many commercial buildings, houses, and churches located along Marshall's Main Street. By 1902, the population was 344. At that time, there were 8 general merchandise stores, 1 barber, 1 blacksmith, 1 shoe store, 2 bookstores, 4 confectionaries, 1 telephone and telegraph office, 2 jewelry stores, 1 saloon, 3 retail grocers, 8 produce stores, 2 crockery and glassware stores, and 1 druggist. In 1903, several local businessmen, including W. J. McLendon, Charles B. Mashburn, and J. R. Swan, possibly this person, established a cotton textile mill, the Capitola Manufacturing Company, on the French Broad River, which provided work for many of the townspeople. The building itself is today listed on the National Register of Historic Places, having been listed back in 2012. Some businesses in Marshall in the first decade of the 20th century included Redmond and Roberts Dry Goods, Redmond Ramsey and Company Tombstones, R. H. Ward Grains, Botanicals, Roots and Herbs, Van Smith Groceries, J. R. Swan Blankets and Shoes, and what was once in this building right here, the Bank of French Broad. Yes, they must have loved this river so much, they decided to name their bank after it. It is such a beautiful river, isn't it, though? Yeah, I know. As I said, we're going to discuss it a bit later. This here, though, the Neoclassical Revival County Courthouse, designed by prominent Asheville-based architect Richard Sharp Smith, was completed in 1907, showing the growing need in the county for expanded civic services, all of which were located here in the county seat. In the years before the flood of 1916, commercial enterprises continued to grow as several additional businesses opened along Main Street, including furniture stores, barber shops, hotels, boarding houses, hardware stores, general stores, doctors' offices, banks, and restaurants. The 1916 Sanborn map indicates there were many commercial buildings along the south side of Main Street, such as a movie house, a barber, the telephone exchange, and the grocery, while only a handful of commercial buildings and primarily churches and residences were located on the north side. Due to the greater accessibility of Marshall after the arrival of the train, there were 2 hotels located on Main Street by 1916, the Montezuma and one called the Rector, with the Montezuma once being located right here. Okay, folks, I did discuss it a bit early on, but was this the worst recorded flood in Marshall's history? The flood of 1916. The flood of 2024 might have broke that record. Possibly. But the flood of 1916 at that time did have a major impact on Marshall. It had to rebuild many of its buildings damaged by the rising floodwaters of the French Broad River. However, almost half of the buildings remaining on Main Street today do date from the first 15 years of the 20th century. Some of these include the Madison County Jail, the Marshall Pharmacy, the Sprinkle and Shelton Company, the Marshall Fire Department, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, this duplex, and a number of commercial buildings. Yes, and as you can probably see, many of these had to be greatly repaired again after the 2024 flood. Some business types in operation in Marshall after the 1916 flood included banks, dry goods stores, hardware stores, automobile showrooms, insurance agencies, grocery stores, realtors, and a milling company. Despite the French Broad being such a moody river, most in the area always seemed to forgive it over time. As the tourism industry took hold, it did become a major draw. In the 1920s, Marshall's population had reached 1,800. As the area became more accessible with improved roads, tourism began to play a major role in the development of downtown. Several boarding houses were active in the community, and new commercial buildings were constructed. Service stations were also built as infill along Main Street. It is recorded that this lot here was once a filling station, though this gabled house-like building does not fit this description as provided via the document. Let's take a walk around, as the building historically is said to have wrapped around at the rear to face Bailey's Branch Road. Definitely, something appears to likely have been altered here. Anyhow, the Sanborn map from 1916 to the one from 1924 show one of the biggest changes along Main Street to be the new construction of service stations and garages to meet the growing needs of the town and the advent of the automobile to be used for transportation. The building that once stood here is listed as once having been the Marshall Motor Company, apparently once being a 20-car garage. Another hotel, the French Broad Hotel, was also in operation by this time. It stood right about in this area along Main. Additional businesses included banks, including the Bank of French Broad, once located in this building, as well as furniture stores, clothing stores, food stores, shoe stores, hardware stores, appliance stores, grocery stores, pharmacies, and cafes. The 1933 Sanborn map shows continued commercial development, with the enlargement of garages and building supply stores, but the construction of new buildings was not nearly as extensive as in the early years of the 20th century. There was a bit of building going on in the 1930s, though, including this apartment building, a few commercial buildings, and this recessed addition to this building. Many of the same businesses did continue to operate in the downtown, with some new businesses at that time having included the new bakery and cafe, the Marshall Coffee Shop, French Broad Chevrolet, and an A&P grocery store, once located right here in this building. When A&P first moved to town, Was it located elsewhere? Reportedly, this building, in 1933, held a drugstore, a telephone exchange, and a meeting hall. Growth in Marshall continued into the 1940s, and there were a number of buildings constructed during this time period, including this commercial building, the L.P. Roberts building, and the Rock Cafe restaurant building. There were also new businesses that came to attest Main Street as continuing to operate as the Commercial, Medical, Legal, and Civic Center of Madison County. These included this building right here that once housed the Belk Broom department store, as well as a variety of jewelry stores, ladies' clothing stores, shoe stores, and doctors' offices. The primary new construction in the 1950s was new church buildings, such as this right here, the Marshall Presbyterian Church. However, Main Street still did continue to thrive as the commercial center for the community, with businesses such as pharmacies, motor companies, banks, department stores, building supply stores, funeral homes, furniture stores, and hardware stores having found their way onto Main Street. In the late 1950s to 1960s, larger communities, such as Asheville, began to draw residents away from Marshall for not only jobs but also shopping, resulting in the beginning of an economic decline for the town. It has only been in recent years that new residents, retirees, and tourists have again come to discover Marshall. As a result, several of its buildings have come to undergo great renovation projects. Though I am not going to delve much into the more recent history of Marshall, I will toward the end of this episode talk about the French Broad River and a bit about the effects of the 2024 flood. At this point in the episode, though, we are now going to take a deeper dive into the architectural history of Marshall. Marshall remains today as the commercial center of the county with the much larger downtown. It now holds a greater concentration of commercial, religious, civic, and industrial buildings than any of the other communities located in the county. The majority of the buildings in the town center are of a commercial style. Exceptions to that include examples of the I House, the Romanesque Revival, the Gothic Revival, the Mission Revival, the Classical style, and the Neoclassical style. Since Marshall has always been the county seat, its variety of architectural styles is greater than other towns within Madison County, such as Mars Hill and Hot Springs. One of the major differences between the county seat and the outlying smaller communities is this: the prominent Neoclassical Revival courthouse. In addition, since most of the county's early 20th century banking took place here in Marshall, prominent bank buildings were designed in the popular, more elaborate Classical and Neoclassical Revival styles. In comparison, most buildings in the commercial centers of Mars Hill and Hot Springs are much more simpler in their architectural detailing. In regards to Marshall, and in terms of domestic housing, most of what was off to the hillsides and not so close to the downtown area. However, as you may already be able to infer, there is that one very important exception. The oldest building on Main Street does so happen to be also the most notable residential building, the Colonel Lawrence M. Allen House. It holds the typical I-house form, being one room in depth and holding a double-tiered porch. It boasts Greek Revival entry detailing, exterior end chimneys, a side gable roof, and a later rear L addition. The I-house was a common form once utilized throughout western North Carolina, from the early 19th century on into the early 20th century. The interior of this house does retain many of its original architectural features, including not only its flush board walls and ceilings, but also its original mantels. The staircase, which can be found in the main hall, still holds its paneled newel posts and tapered balusters, and the arched entry into the living room on the west side of the house's main block is still present. The house is named for Colonel Lawrence Allen, the first clerk of court for the town of Marshall. While not fully documented, it may have been an extension of an earlier cabin built prior to 1849 by David Vance, due to the earlier construction details, including the hand-hewn sill foundation and the wider heart pine board floors that are not seen anywhere else in the house. Are these those such boards? Not sure. Moving on now to one of the oldest commercial buildings to be found here along Main Street. This here is the circa 1899 commercial building that boasts Romanesque Revival elegance. The typical use of that style can be found in the segmental arched windows, the corbelling at the cornice, the iron storefront posts, the double-leaf door, and the decorative transom. Also, brick pilasters can be found set between the bays that extend up above the roofline. The Romanesque Revival style typically does utilize the rounded Roman arch, the use of brick or stone for wall surfaces, and a minimal use of additional architectural detailing. Furthermore, a decorative terracotta band above the storefront, and the use of functional iron support columns also add to the overall decorative character of the building. A deck and some balconies have been added to the rear, along with the rooftop room said to not be visible from Main Street. The original exterior metal stairs on the west wall of the building are said to still remain. The stairs still do exist, although they're not metal. Although not fully documented, a one-time owner has noted the building to have been constructed by 1899, which is possible based on its stylistic form. In 1916, it was a drugstore. Later, it was A&P Grocery. Several buildings in the town center do follow the pattern of many other western North Carolina towns by utilizing the classical styles to enhance the buildings and to make them stand out as prominent structures. The Classical Revival, Neoclassical Revival, and Colonial Revival styles do follow many of the same principles. And the most popular period for these styles, it was from 1900 to 1930. These styles often do utilize elements of earlier classical buildings, including symmetrical proportions, side gable or hip roofs in non-commercial buildings, architrave trim around doors and windows, columns and pilasters and elaborate cornices, all of which are often constructed of limestone. The classical styles were chosen for the more prominent buildings in town associated with the government, the banking industry, and the important commercial buildings, such as the use of limestone trim around the windows here. These styles were used for these types of buildings because of the evocation of stability, tradition, and permanence associated with them. The Neoclassical Revival style Madison County Courthouse, designed by notable Asheville-based architect Richard Sharp Smith, incorporates many elements of the style, including its monumental tetrastyle portico with Corinthian columns, its cupola, and its arched doorway flanked by windows. The courthouse has a superb, unobstructed view of the French Broad River, with a large lawn and walkway leading up to its central entry beneath that monumental portico. Rectangular in plan, the building is set on a foundation of granite, with the facade being divided into 3 sections. The courtroom is said to be located on the 2nd floor. Reportedly, the building, built in 1907, cost $30,000. This here is the classical revival style Bank of French Broad, designed by architect James J. Baldwin. Holds a recessed arched entry, a water table, a cornice with dentil blocks, arched windows, keystones above all the windows, and decorative inset panels. Originally 2 separate structures, the 2 were joined into one building in the late 1970s. And originally, there were multi-light windows within all of the arched openings. However, these were infilled when those 1970 changes were made. The Roberts Building now comprises the east portion, which does include many of the same details as the other half. It does project over the Roberts 1922 name and sized into that limestone panel right there. Then there is this building, the O.C. Rector Building. It holds limestone trim around its cornice and all its windows. Overall, it is a 3-bay, 3-story commercial brick building set in a contiguous row. Inside, the building is said to retain its original tin ceiling. That may be true, but you can't really see inside. It looks like this building is currently being remodeled. At the rear, at the basement level, a loading area can be found. O.C. Rector, erected 1928, can also be found excised into a limestone panel at the cornice. An example of the later use of the colonial revival style dating from circa 1935 is this residential duplex. This building is symmetrical in nature, and it does utilize elements of that style in its side gable roof, pedimented porches, and side gable roof dormers. The building is contiguous to, but slightly recessed back from, the commercial buildings on each side. It replaces an earlier printing company and a grocery warehouse building. The commercial-style buildings in the town center are typical in their design, in their use of primarily brick as their exterior material. The upper facades often range from plain and unornamented to more elaborate with corbelling and decorative brick patterns. Many do hold window arches or keystones. The commercial style was typically a reaction to the more ornate buildings of the Queen Anne style from the late 19th century. 1, 2, or 3-story buildings that feature the commercial style here are often characterized by a first-floor storefront, some masonry patterns, flat roofs, parapet walls, and large windows, often in a 1/1 sash configuration. Such notable commercial-style brick buildings here in Marshall do include this, with its intact storefront of a recessed entry flanked by large display windows, a double-leaf door, and pierced brick at the cornice. Beginning in the 1940s, the occupant of the building has been reported as Belk Broom. Later, it was a hardware store, a livery stable, and a kind of general store. Then, even later yet, it was the Madison County Library. Then, there is this building, a two-story, commercial-style, painted brick building. In the 1920s and 1930s, reportedly, it was used as a store. It is said that a sign does exist on the building for the Story Printing Company, one of its later uses. The most defining feature may be the tall, multi-light transom windows, a central door with the transom above, and a second door that leads up to the second floor, once partially boarded up. Finally, we come to this building here, with its canted corner entry, a storefront that wraps around the corner, and 1-over-1 windows. Reportedly, the corner entry door has been replaced with a double-leaf modern door. Storefront transoms have years later been covered with metal panels. Built circa 1930, the building was reportedly employed in the 1930s as a store of brick and tile construction. The use of stone as an exterior material is also seen on several buildings in the district. Even though fieldstone and river rock was readily available material here in Marshall, as in several other mountain communities, the decision to use these materials was not an arbitrary one. Builders used this stone to showcase this material for its stability, beauty, and character. Spruce Pine's historic downtown, with its use of mica stone, and Black Mountain's central business district, with its extensive use of river rock on many of its buildings, are two other good examples of this conscious decision to create something distinctive out of available materials. Those buildings here in the core of Marshall, built of stone, do include this, built circa 1940, this, built circa 1945, and this, built circa 1947. The detailing of these buildings is similar to some used in a typical commercial style. The stone walls here, however, do add an interesting variation in terms of texture and relation to the indigenous materials found in the mountains. Let's move on now to the Gothic Revival style. So, here we have, yes, a Gothic Revival structure, the Methodist Episcopal Church South. It is built of brick and does incorporate many elements of the style. Not only does it feature asymmetrical massing, but it also features those kinds of windows often found on such buildings. You know, those Gothically arched ones. Wow, it appears they left me a peephole. I mean, none of the other windows have a peephole, so I guess they left this one here for people to get a peekaboo. This is what the interior of the church building looks like right now. I bet this got damaged during the flood, and they needed to do a lot of remodeling here. That's my guess. Look, way back there. There do appear to be stairs. Let's zoom in a bit. I guess it might go to the bell tower thingy, but the Gothic Revival style was most popular from 1830 to 1860, although it continued into the 20th century as a popular style for church buildings. Yes, this church building here does exemplify that. As said, the style is typified by the use of Gothic arch windows, often in stained glass. It also tends to feature steeply pitched roofs. The exterior walls of such structures are often built of brick, stucco, stone, or board and batten. Moving now to the Mission Revival style. So here we have an apartment building done in that style. It does utilize many elements found in that style, including a stepped parapet roofline and a pent tile roof. I have to say that this is an interesting style found in this region, as it tends to be more commonly associated with the southwestern region of the country, yet one can be found right here in Marshall. The Mission Revival style was most popular from 1890 to 1920 and is typically simple in form. It often features things like tile roofs, parapets, curvilinear gables, and small balconies punctuating the surface. This residential building is a later example of the Mission Revival, incorporating many of the features found in that style. Apartments, though, at the time this episode was compiled, it appears to be used as a dentist office. Overall, what makes up the town core of Marshall is unique in the county, and that it incorporates within its boundaries examples of many different building types and styles that exemplify the importance of the town to the county throughout its historic period of significance. It has evolved through time from the middle of the 19th century, comprised then of primarily residences and drovers' stands, to the mixed use it is today. Yes, today it incorporates residences, offices, government structures, churches, stores, and even warehouses. Now, folks, that right there is the French Broad River, as stated earlier. I think, though, the time has now come to discuss it a bit. If you have watched up until this point, you know that a major hurricane struck this region in 2024. That was already discussed, so there is no need to bring it back up. However, there is something else that this river holds, something far more enlightening. You see, this river, it is a success story. But before we get into that, just briefly, this here is the document for the old Marshall High School, for this building you see right here. No, we are not going to be discussing this building in depth. It was listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 2008, making it eligible for its very own episode. However, it does stand as a large part of Marshall's history. Since 2007 up until this present day, it has acted as Marshall High Studios, a famous art collective in town. Given its location, it does sit so eloquently on an island in the middle of the French Broad River. And yes, near the end of 2024, it was devastated by that major flood. However, a year later, plans are being made to keep the art collective going at this location. This is a nice area, I would say, to start our discussion of the French Broad River. Now, I suppose discussing the nature of the French Broad River would be ideal for any town so thriving along its banks. Yes, there are a few, not counting the city of Asheville, such as Hot Springs. Marshall, however, may well be the most known and maybe even the most important. Okay, so there is a book simply called The French Broad, published by Wilma Dykeman in 1955. If you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. There is a chapter in the book devoted exclusively to the state of the river. The way the river used to be treated was very disturbing. It is hard to believe that, with the way we now see it, years upon years have been spent on trying to clean the river up, making it suitable for tourism and recreation. If it was not for the Clean Water Act of 1972, it is unclear if any effort to clean this river up would have even been possible. I am a river advocate myself and have been since the 1990s, so keeping this river cared for is close to my heart. And for those that care, get acquainted with the Clean Water Act. River Network has great information on it, including on how to apply it when necessary. Recent efforts to weaken or gut the Clean Water Act, at least as of the time this episode was compiled, are egregious. Under no conditions should we allow anyone to negatively impact the work that has been done regarding this river over the past many decades. Under no conditions should we tolerate further decline and further degradation. Still, even to this day, as this article insinuates, work still needs to be done. Luckily, for those in this region, this river has a lot of stewards. The French Broad River Keeper works tirelessly to routinely monitor the river. Of course, a large community does exist that will strive at great lengths to continue preserving and protecting this river. A lot of work is done through Mountain True, which hosts the French Broad River Keeper, having over 200 members. With that said, there is more to Marshall I could most definitely discuss. I did not delve much into the more recent history, focusing mainly on the historic document. I did discuss a bit about the impacts of Hurricane Helene on the area, but today Marshall is mostly open to the public, but still is in recovery from the storm, at least as of the time this episode was compiled. Now, as we move on, I will leave you to read a 2018 article strictly devoted to the French Broad River.